The final day of the first Formula One test of 2019 is complete, and we've got a few more answers and plenty more questions, as we always do. But the first thing we're going to do in this video is address yesterday's video, because we spent a lot of time talking about Mercedes, and we even titled the video "The Mystery Around Mercedes." We were expecting to see a bit of pace from the team today, and it's exactly what we've got, so that's going to be our starting point. Mercedes weren't at the top of the times by the end of the day, but they were there and thereabouts. We saw pace from Hamilton and Bottas. Bottas was fourth in the end, Hamilton was fifth. And I've got Gary Anderson and Jack Benyon here with me today to try and work out how much we've learned about Mercedes. And Gary, we'll start with you. You were out trackside, you've been looking at some of the data. We've seen a lap time now from Mercedes, which we didn't have 24 hours ago. But is the picture any clearer? Where do we think they are now?
I think the picture's still a bit muddy, but yes, you have to look a bit deeper into it. The one thing that I saw was basically on the C3 tyre, the yellow sidewall tyre, they did a reasonable lap time relative to what I believe the fuel load would be. But then whenever they went to the C4 tyre, which is a step softer compound, and then they went to the C5 tyre as well, which again is another step softer compound, they never got the advantage that the other teams got out of it. So assuming they ran the same fuel load, because you'd be pretty daft if you didn't, if you're going to try and do a back-to-back and find out how your car works with the different tyres, they need to do something to their car. And I believe they've got, if we look at the car on the track, theirs is one of the cars that has got this little bit of understeer, especially at high speed. All the cars have a little bit of understeer at low speed, but they've got a little bit more at high speed. And as you put a softer compound tyre on any of these cars, you pick up rear grip, which pushes the front. So if you have a little bit of understeer, you get more understeer for every step of compound. So I think they've got a little bit of work to do there. They've had this problem before, but I think they've addressed it. But I think it could be a bigger problem this year because of this change of regulations on the front wing. And out of 10 teams, 9 of them are running what's called a high-rake car, and 1 isn't running a high-rake car. And that one happens to be Mercedes. Now, what the high rake does for you is puts the front wing closer to the ground at low speed. Whenever the car's going slowly, the rear's higher, the front wing's near the ground, so it produces more front downforce from what's called ground effect. And as the car speeds up, the rear of the car compresses down, but the front of the car also compresses down, so the front wing doesn't change height to the ground as much as it does on the Mercedes type setup. So with theirs, when the car's slow, the front wing's further away from the ground, and as the rear of the car settles down, it stays further away from the ground. So they have less ground effect as such from the front wing, and that, I think, is one of the reasons why they're running with what's called a sort of conventional front wing. They're producing their front downforce from wing angle and wing flaps, as opposed to like Ferrari, which have done away with the outboard part of the flaps, just flattened them out completely in front of the tyre. So not only they're producing the downforce from ground effect, which is very consistent and better in traffic, and also the fact that the front wheel is always being steered different angles, and if you've got complicated aerodynamic parts in front of that front wheel, it will change the airflow as you steer the car. So looking at it from this test, I think Mercedes might just have to go away and scratch their head a little bit.
Now, you and Jake Boxall-Legg did a fantastic analysis of all the front wings and how different some of the concepts were. And at the time, you basically said the Ferrari and the Mercedes were at opposite ends of the spectrum. Have the rule changes potentially taken away some of the tools Mercedes were using to mitigate against perhaps the drawbacks of not having high rake?
Yes. It's not really the drawbacks of not having high rake. It's about, I suppose, what you need. Mercedes obviously last year had what they needed to get the grip out of the car, and now that they've taken away all those turning vane stuff from the front wing end plates and top of the front wing furniture, such as we call it. They had probably as complicated an assembly as anybody, if not more. And I think they were quite well on top of how that all functioned, so they could get the front wing performance without needing a high rake. But other teams slowly, because Red Bull were the first to create this sort of high rake car, and other teams slowly followed them. And we were here last year watching the test, and Ferrari sort of ran their car in a high rake sort of attitude. But both Ed Stroll and myself out on track said we didn't actually think what we saw, we didn't think Ferrari were on top of why they were running it at that point in time, because it's about keeping the front wing as near the ground as possible, but they were actually, the front wing was on the ground most of the time. So, they've got a year's experience on it, as the other teams have. They've been slowly coming in over the years and doing it more and more and more. And, and Mercedes have decided that they didn't want to go that route, because it does raise the centre of gravity, it does do other things, but the negative of it really is that you can't now, with these new regulations, produce the front downforce you need without having, as I say, the aggressive front wing that they've got, and then that gets affected by steering luck. So it's a bit of a spiral to nowhere. I think they're going to have to go back and think outside the box.
Interesting stuff. Jack, you and I are teammates on Autosport Live throughout the week. We've noted down all kinds of lap times and tyre compounds, even the ones that are the same colour, that have infuriated us all week. But what did you make of what we saw from Mercedes today? It was a variation from what we'd seen up to now in their programme, wasn't it?
It was nice to see them acknowledge that they needed to put some performance on the board and really, impress some people, if you like, and make that big time. I was very interested with Lewis Hamilton's time, actually, because he ran the C4 tyre, not the C5 that Valtteri Bottas ran. And if you look at the times at the end of the session, Lewis Hamilton's time was exactly 6 tenths slower than Nico Hülkenberg's time, which was the fastest. And Pirelli state that 6 tenths is about the difference between the two tyres. So he's at the Renault pace. If you look at it like that, if Mercedes bolt those new tyres on and they get the best out of them and it is a 6/10 difference, then he set exactly the same time as the Renault. Now, looking at last year, if Mercedes are setting the same time as the Renault, then that's not going to be good, is it? So there's still performance to be found there. I still do think it's a little bit early. Mercedes have had a lot of time to work with their car and decide, how they wanted to go with it. Gary with some great insight there into how the different teams set up the front wing, and it's going to be interesting to see how these new rules really play out. Mercedes have gone over multiple rule changes now with successful cars, so at this point, my faith's still in them that they're going to be the top team. But it was a bit worrying today to see when they went for that performance run that they didn't quite sort of blow everyone away.
Let's come on to Renault, because they were first and third today. Hülkenberg set the pace in the afternoon with a 17.3 on the C5, and in the morning, Ricciardo had done a 17.7. You made the comparison there to Mercedes. I think we'd probably expect that Mercedes might be running a bit heavier than Renault, but Renault are first and third. They've shown their hand a little bit, but not many laps today. I think it was 58. 58 was what they did across the two drivers, and if you look at Ferrari, did 138 with Leclerc, McLaren did 132 with Norris, and Alexander Albon in the Toro Rosso did 136. So those numbers are a long way apart. So if you're quick, but you don't do many laps, in testing, is that a good day or a bad day?
It's difficult to say, isn't it? I think yesterday, I think Renault had a better day yesterday, actually, personally. And the fact that Daniel Kvyat pumped in that last-minute time took the limelight away from Renault, if you like, and sort of made them go under the radar. So today I thought was a worse day. Obviously, the car stopped on track to end the day, which is, that's never going to be good. Like you said, they were bottom. They completed less laps than Williams, who only turned up yesterday. So for me, very knife-edge day. It's great to go and put that time in. It's fantastic to show that you've got that pace, and especially when we're sat here questioning Mercedes' pace and Renault are at the top, that's got to be a great thing for them. But the amount of mileage is really worrying, I think, today. Not getting that long run time that a lot of the other teams had. How many times did we sort of compare long runs against different teams today? Pretty much all of the teams, maybe Racing Point didn't get the full race run in, but the majority did, and we were able to compare and see roughly where everyone is in the order. With Renault, really didn't get that opportunity, so it's going to be a very important test week for them, I think, next week.
What do you make of Renault, Gary?
Well, first thing I think you need to do is know why they stopped. Obviously, they can be doing long setup changes, some of these things to change some of the rear suspension settings. The gearbox and stuff has to come off the car because it's all inside the gearbox now. And those are the things you do during testing, because at a race meeting, you really got to know that if you're going to commit to doing something like that and changing it, you've got to know that it's going to solve your problem. So you would spend a bit of time testing, a bit of downtime, doing it, changing the setup, and going back out again, finding out what it done. That's what it's all about, building your data bank. So if they stopped if they were in trouble because of reliability stuff, then obviously also that's a good thing to do, because it's better to have it here than in Melbourne. But the car looks fine on the track. It's quite deceiving as to they seem to pick the speed up pretty quickly. They had a good race run. If you looked at Hülkenberg's times yesterday when they was doing it, it was a good stable race run. in the ballpark with Mercedes' race runs as well, time-wise. So I do think they made a step forward, and they did end the season last year as sort of the fourth best team, which is that's not where they want to be. But as long as if they can start the season as the fourth best team and maybe a bit closer to the third best team, then I think they'll be pretty happy with where they are, because with Daniel Ricciardo and Nico Hülkenberg, they've got two very good drivers there who, they'll bring home points if you give them the tools to do the job. So I think Renault are, they're probably going to be classified as a real works team this year. They've regrouped and got themselves together, got the personnel in place and stuff. So I'm expecting them to do a pretty good job. Not win races, but do a pretty good job.
And that's why they've signed Daniel Ricciardo, really, isn't it? To take that next step towards becoming a top team. But let's shine the limelight a bit on a team who've starred for the last 2 days, and that's Toro Rosso. Fastest yesterday with Kvyat, and obviously we all really dismissed that as a low fuel, softest tyre run. They did the same thing today with Albon. He was second between the two Renaults. Are those just low fuel runs, you always say, Gary, sniff of an oily rag, fuel runs, or do we have to perhaps take them a bit more seriously? There's a closer tie-up with Red Bull now, so there's going to be the potential for that car to become more and more of a kind of Red Bull light, and I guess that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, it is a good thing. I think that the car, if you look on the track, it's probably the car that's, I suppose you might call it, has the least grip. It moves around a bit. It uses up a little bit more road than the others. It's still fairly well balanced, but it just doesn't seem to have that planted, stance that you like to see from a car that's really just got out and out downforce. So I think there's a bit of room for them to get better, which is a good thing. But I do think their two runs today, and rightly so, were done with a reasonably low fuel load, because the drivers have to learn how to commit to those low fuel runs as well, and it's important for the engineers to learn how the car responds on those low fuel runs, because as I say, whenever you go to Melbourne, there's very little likelihood that Toro Rosso will be on the front of the grid. But if they know how to work the tyres better than some of the others who think they're cleverer, I suppose, then there's a good chance they'll qualify further up the grid. So it's better to get the miles in and do. I've done it the other way around, where a team where we didn't bother running any qualifying runs because the car was very good, and we went to Melbourne and we just couldn't make use of the fresh new tyres. So you've got to do all your work, and I'm sure before the end of the test next week, you'll see everybody sort of wring its neck. Might not be 5 kilograms or the smell of an oily rag, but 20 or something. The big difference in is calculable, but at least it's not heavy enough fuel to be destroying the tyres on the way.
Jack, let's have a final word about Albon. Yeah, I think his week, the first part of his week was characterised by a spin on his outlap, and he's running the green flashing lights on the back of his car because he's not yet experienced enough to. Well, he hadn't had any mileage in an F1 car before the shakedown. So has he come a long way this week? And let's not forget, this is a guy who was experienced at the Formula 2 level, where you covered him last year. So he's not coming in as a sort of complete unknown to top-line single-seater racing, is he? So has he at least been able to establish himself, would you say, with a day like today, where over 100 laps, right at the sharp end, so he got something out of the soft tyres when he run them? That's a good week for a new guy, isn't it?
I think Gary's right. I think you need to know how to run the car in qualifying trim. It's important to do that. I also think that those were two very big confidence boosting runs for two drivers that really needed them. Daniel Kvyat coming back into F1, people questioning why he was chosen. Was it right to give him another chance? So coming in testing and putting a top time, bit of confidence for the driver. Same for Alex, got a very good junior single seater CV, as you mentioned. Went wheel to wheel with Charles Leclerc in 2016 in GP3, and won more races than him. So he's got a very good CV, but he's never driven a Formula 1 car before. The testing runs for Toro Rosso last week, and this is proper debut this week. So like you said, ended up in the gravel trap, not where he wanted to be. He called it a bit silly, I think it was how he described it. But after that, he's turned it around, put in some good laps, some good long runs, got lots of experience in the car. As where they're at is very difficult. I think looking at the race runs today, I still think they're behind Alfa Romeo, and there's a good chance they're behind Renault as well. So I think obviously we don't know how much fuel's been run in the cars, and there's a little bit of things still to be sorted out in that sense. But from the race runs today, especially on the C2 tyre, Giovinazzi and Alfa Romeo looked fantastic, and I think Toro Rosso were just and Alex were just a little bit behind on those runs.